Welcome to TÜSİAD seminar, foreign policy seminar on the geopolitical future of the Western world and Turkey. And we have a distinguished guest, Professor Charles Kupchan from Georgetown University and from Council on Foreign Relations, whose latest book, Isolationism, was, I think, a path-breaking book for those of us who try to understand American foreign policy, the direction that it goes, and what kind of future we should expect in American foreign policy. And obviously, this is of interest to us in Turkey as well, because our relations with the United States these days are a bit tense. And there are plenty of problems. We'll ask those questions of Professor Kupchan as well. Professor Kupchan, welcome, and thanks for being with us. Senem Aydın Düzgit from Sabancı University, Professor Senem Aydın Düzgit from Sabancı University and Istanbul Policy Center is with us as well. Thank you for being here. If you have questions, you can actually write them and then we'll try to answer them. We have about an hour, and then without further ado, I'll start with the first question for Professor Kupchan's initial remarks. You write a lot about the world order as it is shaping and the role of the United States and American foreign policy. In that context, what do you make of the war in Ukraine? Is this a path-breaking development? Is this going to be just a blip? And what kind of world order do you see shaping? And what will be the role of the West, which has dominated the world system for nearly 250 years in the future? Is the decline of the West an exaggerated proposition, or is it a secular trend, and sooner or later it will no longer have as much say over world affairs? And in fact, as you wrote and said on other occasions, the rest of the world is watching this war and not joining the Western efforts to contain Russia or joining the sanctions regime. So thank you again for being with us.
Thank you, Soli. Thank you, Senem, for joining us, and thanks to TÜSİAD for hosting our conversation today. To start off, Soli, I would say that the war in Ukraine has expedited history and speeded up the transition to a world that I think we were ultimately headed to, but we were getting there more slowly.
Okay.
And what I mean by that is that I think we know that the world of 2050 will be a much more multipolar, decentralized world than the world of 2020. And that's because underlying changes in the distribution of power are taking place day by day, month by month, year by year, and they are shifting the global landscape. So by 2050, if you look at projections from major banks and think tanks, the 4 top countries in the world, ranked by their aggregate GDP, will be China #1, India #2, the US #3, and Indonesia #4. India is right now overtaking China in terms of its total population.
Yeah.
India is growing relatively quickly. And in some ways, it's skipping over the industrial era and moving directly to the digital era. They're quite advanced in terms of digital commerce. And so things are changing. And I think it's safe to say that, that world that we're headed toward will be interdependent but multipolar. The other way in which the war, I think, is expediting things is that it's kind of smoking out countries. And we're seeing Russia and China hang together. I'm not convinced that that's a relationship that will withstand the test of time. I think it's a marriage of convenience more than it is a durable alliance, but it nonetheless does mean that, at least for now, there is a counterweight to the West that stretches from Eastern Europe all the way to the Western Pacific. And that's a big chunk of territory. And so we are moving toward a two-block world in which you have liberal democracies on one side, the major autocracies on the other. But it's quite interesting to me that most of the rest of the world is not taking sides. India, Turkey, Brazil, Indonesia, they're all saying, don't ensnare us in this building competition between China and Russia on the one hand and the liberal democracies on the other. And to me, that is a good indication of where we're going to head, right? That we're not going to be in a world where there's liberal democracies over here, autocracies over there, and everybody is in one camp or the other. Much more fluid than that. Finally, on the question of the West, I think a lot depends on the internal abilities of the liberal democracies to recover their political and economic momentum. You know, I'm not surprised that we're headed into more of a polycentric, multipolar world. We knew that was going to happen. What most surprises me is the internal political discontent that has befallen the US, the UK, and other liberal democracies. I certainly did not foresee that coming. And the United States now, I think, will be hard-pressed to come by effective governance for the next 2 years, because I think we're going to see a food fight between a Democratic executive branch and a House of Representatives controlled by the Republicans. So the big question in my mind is, will the West be able to reclaim its efficacy, its political momentum? And my gut tells me yes. And that's because one thing about liberal democracies that we have seen demonstrated is the ability to self-correct, the ability to self-repair, to learn from mistakes. I can't tell you exactly how this self-repair is going to take place, but I think it is, for me, a top priority and ought to be at the forefront of the agenda of the Biden administration and other key governments. The final point here, because I know you're interested in Europe, I think in some strange way, continental Europe is better off politically than either the US or the UK. You know, if there's one country in which the political center has held, it's Germany. Germany has remained a normal liberal democracy. To me, that's very good news.
With center parties still holding their ground, unlike other
Center
places.
left and center right still govern, and they are still ideologically centrist.
So now,
okay, thank you very much. Well, just a few points about your first question, that is the future of the world order, or, you know, what kind of a world might we be looking at after the Russia-Ukraine war? Well, I think, you know, much of the problems or issues that we're debating about the future of the so-called liberal international order, because we can discuss how liberal it is or how international it is, but that's more of an academic debate maybe. But that, in fact, this order has been facing a legitimacy crisis for a very long time, since we no longer live in a bipolar world. And as Charles Kupchan also pointed out, it's becoming a more and more multipolar world, where power is becoming more dispersed. So this legitimacy crisis, in my opinion, will continue as long as, you know, something is done to address it. And what needs to be done to address it is, of course, is the big question that many people are grappling with in the West. Now, I think there is a threefold challenge that the West has to deal with now, and they kind of, and these challenges kind of intertwine with one another. I mean, I work mostly on Europe, so I can say this for Europe, but I would say that the United States faces them, I guess, to some extent as well. Europe has to find a balance between dealing with climate change, bringing economic growth, and also managing the excesses of neoliberalism, and hence deal with rising inequality. And I think this is the problem that Europe has been facing with for a while. And in my opinion, this is at the crux of the rise of the far right in Europe as well, or illiberal movements in Europe, which of course endangers the liberal international order from within, because we're not just dealing with external challenges from countries like Russia and China, but we're actually talking about a challenge from within Europe, that is from within the core of the West as well, and which is finding it, in my opinion, difficult to deal with this rising inequality, with economic problems and gaining economic growth at the same time. And now on top of it, you have the energy crisis, which needs to be resolved much sooner than later, both because of climate change, of course, but also because of the Russia problem that's there. So that's what I want to say, you know, in very short and brief to your, in response to your first question. Now, moving there to the security architecture of the West. Now, of course, the Russia-Ukraine war concerns the security architecture of Europe, right, mainly. Now, but when we look at, for example, where the military assistance to Ukraine comes from, this is mainly from the United States, right? I just looked at the recent figures again, just before this meeting, just, you know, to see if something really has changed. Well, Europe has increased its assistance in 2023. So UK, Canada, plus all of the EU member states and EU institutions combined now all kind of come close to matching US aid. I'm not talking about military assistance, total aid. But in terms of military assistance, it's still the United States. So Europe is nowhere near. Now, of course, this is, I would say, is also in line with the observation that despite the so-called U-turn announced by Germany in its foreign policy right after the war broke out, that U-turn hasn't really happened. So it's been very slow in happening, as the recent controversy over the tanks have also demonstrated. So in that sense, we see a Europe that still doesn't know what to do about its collective defense, you know, in the case that something happens in the United States. And when I refer to something, I'm talking about, of course, a potential change in government. You know, people talk about Trump, but I don't think it's the only Trump phenomena that Europe should be fearing, because it looks as if the Republican Party has been transformed in the mirror image of Trump. So you might have people who are different in name, but quite similar in mentality. And I think that's an important vulnerability for the security of Europe in the long run. Now, and another wide vulnerability, which I mentioned in response to your first question, was that in Europe, there seems to be no leading state on the war between Russia and Ukraine. For now, that's not a big issue, but if you have a change in US government, then that might be. That is this dispersal of who needs to do what in Europe, who needs to get its act together in Europe, I think is still an open question that it's not dealt with. And here, once again, I'm going to conclude by referring to Germany, because, I mean, many, of course, expected leadership from Germany, or, you know, Germany coming close to France when it comes to European defense armament issues. But we see that still most Germans, that is the public opinion, is very reluctant for a stronger engagement in global affairs. I've just recently checked the data by the Berlin Pulse survey, where it shows that 7 out of 10 Germans are against Germany's military leadership in Europe. And as long as you have, I mean, on the one hand, it's a good thing, because if you have, you know, military armament sort of increasing in one member state, you know that the public opinion will keep it accountable. So in that sense, the German democracy is strong, and it's good that mainstream is still in power. But on the other hand, it's also a cause for concern in the sense that German politicians are often very reluctant to get engaged in international military engagement, international military support to Ukraine or elsewhere, or who knows what happens afterwards. So I think this is going to be a major issue to come. So I think it also depends very much on how long this war will continue, whether it will continue into the summer, or whether Russia makes gains in spring and summer, and that we might be facing another winter where Europe might again have to concern itself with energy and the rising inflation. I mean, this winter it seemed to do quite well, I think, to be fair. It sort of stuck to its sanctions, it managed its energy resources well, it sort of managed to at least control the domestic costs of the war to its constituencies. But the longer this war lasts, I think the more difficult it will be for Europe to keep this up. So I think this is also something to keep in mind when we try to think of the situation beyond and past the war.
What would you say? I'd like to add maybe a couple of things. I mean, the general interpretation after this war was waged, after the invasion, was that the Western alliance was reinvigorated. The United States was stopping its exit from Europe, or its disengagement from Europe. And that NATO was going to be the institution around which the Western alliance was going to be rebuilt. And in fact, two long-standing neutral countries, Finland and Sweden, applied for membership. First of all, what Senem says and what you have indicated implicitly in your opening remarks suggests that that may not necessarily be so, because Ukraine may be more important for Europe than perhaps for the US, especially as you enter your electoral cycle in 2024. Secondly, I think we're at an impasse, and Russia cannot lose this war, and where we are, the West cannot really allow Ukraine to lose either. On the other hand, if the will to help Ukraine, to arm Ukraine, dwindles by the end of this year, how does Ukraine actually fight? And then how does this war end?
Yeah. I am surprised by how firm and durable the US-European coalition supporting Ukraine has been, right? If we had been in this room 6 months ago, I would have thought that by the winter, given energy prices in Europe, that you might begin to see some cracks in the coalition. And that has not yet happened. And I think it really is a testament to the degree to which the US and Europe mostly see eye to eye on this and are ready to continue to provide support. That having been said, I don't think the support is, one can count on it indefinitely, especially given that the Republicans are now in control of the House and have explicitly said, no blank check, we're not going to be willing to continue to provide the levels of assistance that we've seen. Does that mean that the flow of aid to Ukraine is going to stop? No. It does mean that the domestic politics of managing the war in the US have become more difficult, and Biden may have to scale back some of his assistance in order to win over support in Congress. The bigger picture is, notwithstanding Senem's comments about Trump and NATO, I think that the recommitment of the United States to Europe is here to stay, in the sense that Europe has come back into focus. No matter how this war ends, I think the US will perceive there to be a need to keep US troops forward deployed for the foreseeable future, at least as long as Putin is in power. And in that sense, I don't see the Republicans, were they to win, pulling out of NATO. I don't see it whether it's DeSantis or Trump or anyone else, seeing that as a politically desirable outcome. So I think we're probably in a situation in which Europeans can count on the presence of the United States for the foreseeable future. One other comment I want to pick up on. I completely agree with Senem about what she called neoliberalism, because I think that what's eating away at the West can be described as the product of neoliberal overreach that really set in the 1990s. And it was overreach at home and overreach abroad. I think that, you know, in the case of the United States, the Democrats really moved quite dramatically to the right. That's when you went through a period of deregulation, let the market take its course, free trade, China joins the WTO, Russia joins the G7 and the G8. The liberal world order is going to be globalized. And then we wake up and, you know, working Americans are sitting around saying, what the hell happened? Right? I used to make $30 an hour working a production line at GM, and I now work at Walmart for $11 an hour. And I got 3 kids and I can't make ends meet. And that to me is at the heart of the polarization and dysfunction that we see on both sides of the Atlantic. And I'm not surprised that the United States and the United Kingdom are the worst hit, because they have embraced neoliberal orthodoxy more than continental Europe has. And in some ways, American politics and British politics are in a race to the bottom. And I do think that there needs to be a course correction to get working Americans and working Italians and working Brits back up on their feet. This to me is really the central socioeconomic challenge facing the Western world. I think Senem and I are in complete agreement on that front.
Okay, I'll ask you a follow-up question, and then Senem, if you could pick it up from a European perspective, and that is, what does this recommitment to Europe do to the so-called American pivot to Asia? I mean, there are newspaper reports that your armaments industry cannot keep up with the supply of weapons to Ukraine, and I suppose you needed those weapons in order to be a credible balancer to China in Asia. So this also appears to be an unsustainable position, and China is your major challenger. That's not number one. And number two, in your book, Isolationism, you talk about 3 options for American foreign policy. One is, of course, isolationism, which you say, in a bit controversially, in my judgment, for the 19th century, that was the default option for the American Republic. The second option is to continue with liberal interventionism or internationalism, if you will. And the third one, the one that you advocate, is judicious retrenchment. That is, keep some commitments, but don't overcommit everywhere. So where do we go? And then, Senem, depending on which road the US chooses, what does Europe do, especially given the fact that the Europeans don't seem to share, just like all the other, the so-called global South, the American approach to China. I mean, Scholz very famously went with a plane load of business people to China in order to make sure that the Chinese market would not be lost. So go ahead, please.
On the pivot to Asia, there's no question that the war in Ukraine slows it down and perhaps puts it on hold. And there are plenty of voices in the United States now who lament the fact that Europe has come back center stage, because they believe that the challenge of the day is China, and that the United States should be focusing like a laser beam on China. And as you have aircraft and troops and surface vessels, Navy ships going to Europe instead of Asia, there's heartache for those people who want a China first, Asia first policy. I think that the implication of this is that for the foreseeable future, the US is going to have to focus on this as a joint theater that requires a fairly robust forward presence on both flanks, both in Europe and in the Asia Pacific.
And you have the means?
Well, it probably means increased defense spending. And yes, right now, US defense industries are flat out, mainly because they're producing for Ukraine. And I'm guessing that this is a sort of development that is likely to continue and to deepen. So if you're thinking about buying stock in US defense companies, this might be a good time to do it.
Thanks.
Yeah. On the options for US grand strategy, the liberal internationalists still rule the roost. They're calling the shots. I would say that that top tier of leadership in the Biden administration, they all hail from the generation that cut its teeth during the Cold War and the early post-Cold War unipolar era. And in many respects, their views of the world have been reanimated by Russia's invasion of Ukraine. But I do think that the domestic foundation for the pursuit of that policy is extraordinarily fragile. And in my mind, one rather euphemistic, intuitive way to understand Trump is that he was a response to a primal scream in the American electorate, which was too much world, not enough America. What about us? Why can't we build schools in Kansas rather than Kandahar? Why are we spending so much money in the far parts of eastern Ukraine rather than right here at home? And not to sound flip here, but there is a certain rationale to that view, and one could argue that the future of the West will be determined more by elections in Ohio than by the outcome in Donbass. And as a consequence, we do have to find the right balance between helping Ukraine defend itself, spending money abroad, and repairing the United States from the inside out so that the illiberal populists don't, in the end of the day, win over and take over the country, which right now is, we don't know. It's an open question. And it's partly for that reason that I think we need to find that sweet spot between doing too much and doing too little. Doing too little is very dangerous in a globalized and interdependent world. Doing too much and not recognizing the domestic vulnerability, the internal threat, not the external threat, could be to advantage and ultimately hand victory to the illiberal populists.
Sana?
Okay, thank you. Well, I'm happy to hear about the US commitment to Europe, that this will continue, in the sense that, because if we look at what Europe is doing in terms of joint defense initiatives, it's very, very little, if not non-existent. And it doesn't seem to do anything substantial. It looks like it won't be able to do anything substantial in the near-time future. So it will have to depend on the United States. So I think it's important that the United States commitment will be there to stay. But I also agree with Solly that this might come with some strings attached. And the US position on China and Asia in general would be a part of that package. I mean, the rift is there, I think, and not just on China, but also on economic issues. Just look at the recent Inflation Reduction Act in the United States and how it has basically rattled all of the European Union with all its institutions, key member states like France and Germany. And seriously, there are only two major headlines in Europe today. One, of course, is the war and inflation and energy that is related to it. And the second one is the Inflation Reduction Act and what this is going to do to the competitiveness of the European single market. And Europe doesn't know how it's going to respond to that, but it looks like this tendency of, again, doing something for America, as Charles has correctly put it, as focusing a bit more on American jobs, competitiveness. I mean, this is, I think, now it's sort of something shared by both of the political parties. With Democrats, of course, the way in which they communicate this to European partners, I would say, is much softer, maybe listening more to European concerns, seeing if there are ways of getting around them. But of course, with a Republican administration, that might come a little bit more harsher on the European partners as well. But in my opinion, that rift there will continue. And what it might result in is that it might result in more protectionist European policies. Like, for instance, now they're discussing about loosening EU rules on state aids to major industries in France and Germany. And, similar measures might follow. So when we talk about the future of the liberal world order, when you look at the trade component of it, the fact that, more isolationism in terms of trade, these tendencies might continue and one might spark the other. So that's something to look at. And similarly on China as well. So I think here too, in my opinion, especially, again, there are so many variables at work here, especially if we assume that the war will continue for a while to come. I think Europe would have to forget about a sort of a major investment partnership with China, which it has already, put somewhere on the shelf. It's been frozen for a time being, thanks to the parliament. But, we know that European leaders want to bring it back. So I think that will be there for a while to stay. And that might be one of the conditions attached, and that Europe might just have to do with, given that it will need American recommitment, especially if this war is not resolved in a reasonable time frame.
Thank you. Before we move on to Turkey, there is a question from Hüseyin Geliş, and that is, in terms of the geopolitical trends in the years to come, at which degree do you believe the West and USA need China as an innovation partner? And then Alper Uçok asks, are we seeing the final disintegration of the Russian Empire, which still holds the world's 1/8 of the world's landmass? And can a defeated Russia keep its current borders? What could be the consequences to China, for China?
Just picking up on a couple of points that Senem has made, I completely agree that this is a learnable moment for the EU's defense aspirations. We're not going to have a better test case than a Russian invasion of Ukraine to see whether the EU can turn the corner on defense. And the answer right now is no, because you're getting ostensibly 100 billion euros of new defense spending in Germany, but they're moving very slowly.
Snail's pace.
And I don't see any sign that the core countries are ready to pool sovereignty on procurement, on defense policy. And until that happens, nothing is really going to come of this push for strategic autonomy. And especially given the war, the idea of Europe being on its own has very little appeal to most Europeans. And so
Macron's European autonomy.
Not in the cards.
Okay.
More defense spending is great. Europe will ultimately be a better partner, but I don't foresee Europe emerging as a new pole of military power. You mentioned, Senem, also the the Inflation Reduction Act and differences over China, and I agree with you. But I also think that we are witnessing an inflection point in the nature of the global political economy. And I am expecting there to be more state aid in the EU. I am expecting there to be industrial policy on both sides of the Atlantic in a way that would not have been thinkable before. And that's in part to address climate change, but it's also in part to rebuild infrastructure and to try to get assistance, at least in the American case, into the heartland, where a lot of people are struggling and where it may well take government direction to try to get workers back up on their feet. And so I think we've really passed through the high point of neoliberalism and globalization. We are in an era of deglobalization and decoupling, and I think it's going to occur on both sides of the Atlantic. And that brings me to the whole question of the relationship with China. You know, I have somewhat mixed feelings about the US order on semiconductors. I understand where it's coming from, because it stems from a desire to keep several steps ahead of China on critical technologies, but it also does open the door to a real fundamental decoupling from China. And I don't know, I mean, de-risk, yes. Decouple, do we really want to sort of undo a world of global interdependence? And I don't know where we're going on there. I think we're at kind of an inflection point that's to be determined. And one of the things that I find very concerning is that much of what we collectively need to do in the world, we cannot do without China, right? We're not going to tackle climate change without China. We're not going to deal with nuclear proliferation in the North Korea and Irans without China. We're not going to deal with governance of the cybersphere. So I think we have to find some way of competing with China, of standing up to China, but at the same time finding some way to work with them on these critical global issues. Is this the end of the Russian Empire? I don't know if I'd put it in those terms, but this is a dark moment for Russia. Yes, much of the world is sitting on the sidelines, but I think this, historians will look back at this war as a fundamental strategic setback for Russia. I think it's already happened. I mean, the Russians are not doing well in Ukraine. They are severely economically isolated and diplomatically isolated. Russians are leaving the country in droves.
They're our neighbors here.
This is not a Russia's finest hour.
Okay, I want to get to Turkey before I look at the second bunch of questions. Okay, you have just written for TÜSİAD's BBI program, Berlin Bosphorus Initiative program, an article that the likes of which I have not seen in a long time about Turkish-American relations. It's called From Estrangement to Partnership. And you basically provide both a roadmap and a very optimistic message saying the differences are not irreconcilable and the two countries actually need one another, whether they accept that or not. And so we should actually try to make an effort. But then 57% of the Turkish public believes that the United States is the #1 threat to Turkish security. And you yourself in your opening remarks said that countries like Brazil, South Africa, Turkey are waiting on the sidelines and not supporting the Western sanctions regime, but Turkey happens to be a member of the Western alliance. So how do we square all these things? And of course, there is now the issue of Turkey as a NATO member at a time when the organization is supposed to be the central organization of the Western alliance, wants to expand, and Turkey has bilateral problems with Sweden, and it blocks the accession of Sweden and Finland. Are these things really repairable, or are these things, can these things be overcome?
I do believe that it is in Turkey's interest to have a good relationship with the United States and the West, and it is in Western interests to have a good and constructive relationship with Turkey. And from an American perspective, as someone who believes that we are headed into a much more fluid, unpredictable, polycentric world, I want as many countries as possible to be with us. And I say that purely out of national self-interest. And in particular, I think it's important for the United States to have Turkey on our side, because I think we are witnessing an era of American retrenchment from this part of the world. Afghanistan is probably the clearest example. I don't think the United States is going to pack up and take its forces out of the broader Persian Gulf, Middle East region, but there will be a lighter American touch here for the foreseeable future. I think we just saw it this week in Israel, where the Secretary of State made a visit, but this will not be a visit that's remembered for anything. This was mowing the grass. This was not the US trying to seriously push the ball one way or the other way. And I think that's an indication of things to come. And so when I asked myself, well, if the US wants a lighter touch in the region, what countries can it look to help pursue common interests? There aren't a lot of options. It's not going to be Iran, right? It's not going to be Syria. It's not going to be Lebanon. Iraq, is trying to make it through the day. It's Turkey. And so I see Turkey as a country with which the United States has a vested interest in having a good relationship. And then I flip it around and I say, well, what's Turkey? Where is Turkey's long-term future best secured? In alliance with Vladimir Putin? In an alliance with Tehran? No. Looking west, but keeping its options open. Deepening and repairing its trade and economic relationship with Europe and the United States, but keeping its options open and having the ability to have good relationships with China and Russia, if possible, at the same time. But I think for Turkey to play the role of pivot, for it to be a bridge builder between East and West, it has to be anchored in the West. Because otherwise, I think Western capitals won't have sufficient confidence in Turkey's intentions. So I think the order is re-anchor Turkey in its Western vocation will best set up Turkey to be a bridge builder.
Okay, Sena?
Okay, I will move to the Turkey question, but before I do that, let me just say, in response to the question about Russia facing a complete defeat, or can it face a complete defeat? I think there was a question along those lines. Well, I'm not sure if complete defeating of Russia is a desirable option or a realistic one, given the possibility of a nuclear war or another world war. So I think I know some people might not be happy with hearing this, because, there is a certain amount of individuals who think we should, Russia should be defeated all the way. But I'm not sure whether this should be the ultimate goal here, if we want to minimize the costs to the West, but also, globally. So that's what I wanted to say in response to the question about Russia's complete defeat. Now, about Turkey, now, if I may, when we try to unpack Turkish foreign policy towards the United States, but also Europe and the West in general, I did read the piece by Charles, and I enjoyed it very much. And there he talks, and he does mention the concept of interests, right? And you've just mentioned it also in your remarks, that basically, you know, it's all about divergence or the convergence of interests between the two sides, and it is in the interests of Turkey not to fully be aligned with, you know, Putin's Russia, etc. But I think much of Turkey's contestation of the West, and again, of the so-called liberal international order, I think has to do with its search for regime security on the inside. So it's not really, so I think the question that we must ask ourselves, and I think the question that the West should ask itself when it's trying to decipher Turkish foreign policy or elements of it, is how does this serve the interest of the regime in terms of surviving in power? Because I think in today's Turkey, this is the prime determinant of so-called national interest, right? And that's how national interest is determined. And here I think we can unpack this a little bit further. So when we try to understand or answer the question of how central is a policy area to the government's survival prospects, I think there are three important pillars that we need to consider in making sense of Turkish foreign policy. That is nationalism, state capitalism, and the issue of domestic legitimacy. Nationalism is pretty straightforward because it basically refers to the ruling regime's need to remain nationalist, since it needs and requires the ultra-nationalist alliance to remain in power. So that necessitates a certain dose of nationalism. But state capitalism is an important part of it. So all that story about military aggrandizement, the drone technology, energy, construction sector, expansion, etc., that all has to do with feeding a personalized network of capital accumulation. So that's part of this, that's why I call it state capitalism, as some scholars do in the literature as well, to refer to the state of the Turkish economic and governance model. Of course, the issue of domestic legitimacy. So when you see, for instance, when you look at controversies in the Eastern Mediterranean, you see that it's quickly turned domestically into, you know, people's fight against, you know, the West, the hostile others, etc., and turns into a source of domestic support and legitimacy for the government. And I don't think we can even understand Turkey's stance toward NATO membership of Sweden and Finland without taking into account this factor of regime security. It's not just a matter of trying to balance between Russia and Europe because of Turkey's growing economic needs. Yes, of course, this is a very important part of the story, but it's also the dependence on Russia and Putin in consideration of their support for the current government and the ruling regime. So one has to, I think, keep that in mind as well. That is the external support for the regime, external authoritarian support for the regime that needs to be considered when one's trying to make sense of Turkey's demands or resistance, etc., in NATO as well. So the reason why I felt the need to underline that is because I think there is still ground for optimism when one considers the fact that not every power constellation in Turkey would have the similar set of interests in keeping this kind of foreign policy. So I think a change is possible. Because this form of state capitalism, for example, would not serve well a coalition of different actors whose political survival would really rely on the recovery of the Turkish economy and structural reform and, you know, the path of economic growth and employment. Or, you know, a different set of constellation of political actors would not or might not see their interests served by an ultra-nationalist foreign policy where their domestic legitimacy would probably lie on performance, if not on anything else. So I would expect a much more balanced relationship that goes back to trying to really define what the country's national interests are, as in the lines that, you know, Charles was writing about and is decided. So in that sense, there is an opening on that front when you sort of unpack and try to analytically account for the way in which Turkish foreign policy is today. And similarly, for example, in your paper, you know, when you talk about the U-turn in Turkish government towards Assad and Syria, and how that might, you know, create an opening perhaps for reconciliation with the US on the YPG question, of course, you know, that would be much easier handled perhaps with an opposition government who doesn't have the baggage that it has with Assad, right? I mean, in that sense, I think a change is possible when you sort of formulate the problem along these lines. And of course, that would mean that much of it would hinge on domestic developments in Turkey as well, for a much more genuinely balanced relations between Russia and the West, and a more constructive relationship between the West and Turkey.
We'll give the last word to our guest, but first, do you have a specific question you want to address to him?
No.
No? Why not?
Shall I?
You should, you must. Okay. Well, you'll probably respond to what she said. Now, my question will be more simple. What's the game breaker? Turkey not getting F-16s, is that tied to Sweden being admitted to NATO? If Turkey continues to veto it, will that be a game breaker? And how do you bounce back from that if that happens? I mean, you've also worked in the US government, in the Obama administration. What are the mechanisms through which that you can actually start rebuilding the bridges, or rebuilding or reopening the channels of communications?
Yeah. Just a quick follow-up to Sanem's comment about Ukraine, because I think it's important and I'm in agreement. I think that we need to have a sober conversation about Ukraine's war aims, because I do think that it may be politically advantageous and morally justified to talk about a Ukrainian victory and an expulsion of Russia from all Ukrainian territory, but we do have to take into consideration the risks associated with those goals. And I'm someone who believes that there is a not insignificant risk of a nuclear war and or a full-on war between NATO and Russia were Russia to be confronted with the expulsion from Crimea. And so we need to have a conversation sooner rather than later about where this war is going and about what we consider to be an acceptable as well as a strategically prudent endgame. It's an uncomfortable conversation, but it is one that needs to be had.
Who has that conversation? Is China part of that conversation? Does the US and Russia have that conversation, or does Europe join?
I mean, I think it's a conversation that has multiple moving parts. One is US-Europe, and I'm guessing that it's a conversation that the Europeans want to have and have tried to have.
Okay. Unsuccessfully or successfully?
I can't tell,
Okay,
because I don't know what goes on behind closed doors. I think the Biden administration knows that that conversation is coming, but has not yet necessarily had it. And then then you have to have tough love with Kyiv. And then ultimately that tough love with Kyiv turns into a conversation that includes Russia. Now, are you going to find some kind of meeting of the minds and common ground with the Russians and the Ukrainians? I don't know.
and China will not be party to this in your mind. I mean, you said earlier that decoupling, whatever, deglobalization were not necessarily good things, that you needed to communicate and cooperate with China on issues such as climate. But if your fears are well grounded and we risk a nuclear war, don't you think that you should also be talking to China, which might have more leverage on Moscow because they happen to be partners?
Yes.
So how do you do that?
I think we have already tried on numerous occasions to get Xi Jinping to lean on Putin and we have not had much success.
Okay,
That having been said, the Chinese have not armed Russia.
Yeah.
And they have not openly violated sanctions. And so the Chinese are, they are to some extent treading carefully.
Okay.
They're not jumping into bed with the Russians and supporting us. I think everything else being equal, they would like this war to come to an end sooner rather than later.
right.
And so it may be that at that moment, when Putin is considering sitting down and having a conversation about how to bring this to an end, you ask Beijing to weigh in. That's certainly,
Okay.
but I don't see China as a country with direct interests in Ukraine. They're not there yet.
Okay.
On the Turkey question, I think that the relationship is to some extent personality specific, and that in Erdogan and those around him, there is a regime that is resting upon a certain set of political constituents, which Senem well described. And that is in part why a narrative that is somewhat anti-Western and anti-American continues to get a great deal of traction, but it's not one that is shared across the spectrum in Turkey. And as a consequence, I share the view that there is nothing indelible about the current trajectory of Turkish foreign policy and the degree to which poking the finger at Uncle Sam has to be part of that approach. I could imagine a very different kind of tilt.
In fact, the opposition just came up with their very long list of suggestions about all matters, what they will do if they come to power, and on their foreign policy, of course, ameliorating or rebuilding or repairing relations with Western partners does have prominence.
Yes, and I would, especially for a Turkish audience, point out that I do think that there is an opening in Washington. The fact that the Biden administration has informally notified that they want to sell F-16s and provide upgrades to existing F-16s says to me that everything else being equal, there is a desire to improve the relationship with Turkey, including with Mr. Erdogan. And that, yes, if we go back to the pre-Ukraine war era, there was a reasonable amount of Turkey bashing in Washington. You don't hear much of that anymore. I think that the pro-Turkey lobby is not there. That has disappeared. But I do think that there is an open door in Washington. Would blocking Swedish accession be a deal breaker? It certainly wouldn't help. But my prediction is that after the election, regardless of who wins, Turkish objections will find a way of standing down.
Okay, very quickly, because we ran out of time. Many Turks complain, some more rationally than others, that the more even-handed approach that Washington used to have between Greece and Turkey have been dropped, and the appearance or the interpretation here is that the Biden administration which actually a trend that started with the Trump administration, treats Greece more favorably. First, is that your impression? And is that also something, a move that prepares the United States if the estrangement with Turkey continues, rather than a move to partnership that you suggest? That's a substitute.
I am aware of the data points that inform your question. I can't say that I detect a surge in pro-Greece sentiment in the foreign policy community. I think it is in part a function of the war in Ukraine and the role that Greece has played in terms of port access and other access. I also think it is in some ways an unfortunate consequence of a very strained relationship with Turkey. And everything else being equal, I think the US would lean into its strategic relationship with Turkey if that were available. And as we've been talking about, the availability of that kind of partnership has been difficult to come by. And as I wrote about in the paper, there are explanations that are, there has been a fundamental clash of interest. And both sides are responsible. But I do think that some of the sources of that discontent, in particular, the US partnering with the YPG to take down a lot of that stuff is behind us. And that's why I do think that we can have a constructive conversation that may yield fruit about how to improve the US-Turkey relationship.
Thank you. Any final words?
No, I think, this has been a great discussion, but maybe just a point of perhaps clarification that I want to add on our discussion of anti-Americanism in Turkey or anti-Westernism is, I think we need to be careful when we try to evaluate the extent to which Turkish public is anti-Western, because anti-Westernism is not uniform in Turkey. Anti-Americanism, yes, it's quite widespread, in my opinion, across different political party group supporters. But people don't harbor exactly the same anti-sentiment towards Europe. So I think one needs to distinguish between Europe and the United States with respect to how they're perceived in the Turkish public. And that gives, of course, any Turkish political parties some leeway in kind of steering a more positive relationship with the West, if, of course, they want to do that.
A young and upcoming scholar asked the question whether or not China would use their position vis-a-vis this war to make Russia indebted to them, especially if they're also part of a brokered ceasefire or peace. Just a couple of words, and then I'll thank you, and then we'll end our webinar.
Okay. I think that one result of this war is that Russia is becoming increasingly dependent on China for everything, for moral support, political support, sale of gas and oil. I think Russia is finding the world a fairly lonely place. If you're turning to Iran and North Korea to restock your armaments, you know you're in trouble.
Yeah.
My prediction is that asymmetry that's developing between Russia and China will not wear well. That the Russians over time will find it annoying to be China's junior partner. And I think that beneath the surface of what they call a partnership with no limits are limits.
Okay.
And that in the Arctic, in Central Asia, in this part of the world,
At their border too.
at their border, the Russians are not so wild about the Chinese showing up and the 1.4 billion of them. And this was part of what I said earlier. I'm not sure the Sino-Russian relationship is going to turn into a full-fledged, wonderful brotherhood that will last for decades.
Well, Senem Aydın, thank you. Charles Kupchan, thank you not just for this very open and very frank answer, all these frank answers, but also for a very, very well thought out, very positive, very constructive paper, which I encourage everyone who may not have read it to actually read it. Thank you, and we'll bring this webinar to conclusion. Good afternoon and good weekend to you all. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.